Welcome to WebRTC Live. In WebRTC Live, we cover the latest technical topics and business use cases for WebRTC and live video. As always, this episode is brought to you by WebRTC.Ventures, leading integrators of WebRTC video into your custom application.
Welcome back to WebRTC Live. I'm your host, Aaron Syme, founder and CEO of WebRTC.Ventures. WebRTC.Ventures is a custom design and development agency focused on building live video applications. We're here to help you take your application live. You can learn more about us at WebRTC.Ventures. Thanks for joining us live today on YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitch. Welcome also to any of you watching a replay of today's event. For those of you with us live, you can ask questions throughout the stream by leaving a comment in whichever platform you're viewing this. For today's episode, I'd like to welcome Fred Posner. Fred has been working with Kamailio for more than 15 years. He loves to show how Kamailio can help secure and enable communication using well-deployed open source software. He actively participates in the VoIP community, including Kamailio World, AstriCon, ClueCon, and other groups providing support for open source and branded communication software. Thanks for joining me today, Fred.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Definitely, I think overdue on WebRTC Live to have an expert on SIP and telephony in the conversation. So I've been looking forward to this presentation for sure. And for those of you watching us live, anytime throughout, you can put any questions into the streaming platform you're using. And then after Fred's presentation, we'll come back to your Q&A. So stick around. I know Fred's looking forward to your questions. So Fred, why don't I switch it over to you?
Thank you so much. Today, I would love to talk about using Kamailio to connect WebRTC to SIP and, if you need to, the PSTN and some of the aspects that we see Kamailio being used for in real-world applications here. And thank you for having me again. Quick agenda. It's going to be quick on the slides. I'm hoping that there's going to be some good questions. Questions are my favorite part of any presentation. So please, if you have any questions whatsoever, ask them. Even if you don't think it's a great question, I guarantee you someone else has that same question and you'll only help them, which is how open source works, right? Let's try to help others by getting everything out there. So we'll do a quick introduction and it will be quick. We'll talk about what is Kamailio, and then we'll talk about using Kamailio as a WebRTC bridge. And then we'll hit your questions and hopefully there'll be some answers to them. All right, so let's go with the introduction. My name is Fred. I'm a VoIP consultant with LOD. I'm based in Florida. My favorite way to communicate with people is on Matrix. And so my Matrix address is down there. I'm also on Twitter with at Fred Posner. There's a picture of me with facial hair and my beautiful daughter and wife. And I love doing voice over IP. I've been doing this for about 20 years. Been actively using Kamailio for over 15 of those. First started with getting into Asterisk and things like that. I have a whole fun origin story in how I got into OpenSARE/Kamailio in the first place, but we'll save that for another day. And, before this, I worked in various other related fields. So let's get right into it. What is Kamailio? So first, the greatest resource for Kamailio is Kamailio.org. So just point your favorite browser, which since this is WebRTC, I assume that's Chrome for most of you, to Kamailio.org. We're also on Twitter at Kamailio. And we are an open source SIP server. It's been there for about 20 years and running a little bit longer. We're a module-based system. We're very fast and very light, unlike me. So open source, because it's 20 years old, a lot of it is GPL v2 still. So our licensing is GPL v2 and newer. It started off as a project for SARE, then became OpenSARE. There was a renaming and a fork in, like, say, 2008 or so, 2000, yeah, right around there. And then since then, there's been constant development with Kamailio. There's a core and a module-based system so that you can add what you need to keep it very fast, very light for your needs. When I say that there's modules, we have over 150 modules. You know, if you need to connect to Redis, we have a module for that. If you need to connect to Maria or MySQL, module. For WebSockets, we have a module for that. There's also modules for RTP proxying and things like that. When we say it's fast and lightweight, if we're talking about stateless mode and let's say doing load balancing, 5,000 calls per second is not unusual. Excuse me. We can do a lot of call setups very quickly, and that's because we are a SIP proxy. If we want to do registrations or things like that, having 300,000 endpoints with, let's say, 4 gigs of RAM, absolutely doable. So we can do large scale deployments. And, you know, large scale deployments, rapid calls. So you see us a lot in call centers, as well as, you know, carriers use Kamailio quite a bit as well. And anytime where you want to do some failover and load balancing and things like that. So there's been continuous development of Kamailio since 2001. We are mostly GPL v2 based. There's BSD licensing in there as well. Again, open source. Where you really like using Kamailio and where some of our most common use cases are, for example, would be, let's say, NAT assistance, right? Because NAT and people on WebRTC know better than most people how fun NAT is to handle. Kamailio does very good with NAT handling and figuring out where the address is. You know, you don't need stuns and things like that as much. We can do bridging from, let's say, IPv6 to IPv4, which can really help when you want to keep an existing network the way it is, but still branch out to people with IPv6, but not change everything that's legacy. No problem on our end. For SQL backends, we have PostgreSQL, MariaDB, MySQL, Redis, and, you know, including a lot of NoDBs like Redis, Mongo. We can do SQLite. There's a TextDB. So any kind of data storage that you can think of, we probably integrate to, as well as API-based controls. So if you wanted to keep everything within, let's say, most of your web kind of partitioning, with sending an API, getting results back, we can integrate with that very well with what we call a VAPI. We also use Kimi, which is an embedded language interpreter, so that you could write most of your Kamailio config in, let's say, JavaScript or Python, Lua, things like that. So Kamailio basically does registrar server. It does location. It's a proxy that helps you with redirect serving and application serving of SIP as well. Your best use scenario that I see with WebRTC would be as a SIP edge router. And the aspect there would be handling, let's say, bridging and security. So we could do a load balancing from, let's say, WebRTC endpoints to whatever application or server that we need to hit. We could balance through them. So, you know, for failover and everything else, we can handle security firewalls. So we could test for everything from user agent to IP listing to calls per second to flooding, anything that you can think of that might protect your end application from aggressive users. So, you know, sloth attacks, anything that we can think of, we can use to protect our interior. That's where Kamailio can be really fun in its customization as to how we can interpret and attack a design. So you could say, okay, well, here I have a list of different IPs that I'm going to allow. However, we all know that most people might change, or especially if they're, you know, visiting, you know, connecting to you from hotspots or anything like that. You can't really just do an allow list. So you need other methods. So it could be true authentication with password and username, or it could be token based, however you can think of using it, we can connect and manage that security for you. We can do least cost routing. You're seeing Kamailio used a lot in IMS and mobile type presence now, as well as instant messaging and presence. Now, where I really like to kind of highlight here is the difference between a proxy and a PBX, because some people just say, hey, well, SIP is SIP. So a SIP proxy is different than what you would call a phone server or a PBX. Let's say something like Asterisk or FreeSwitch would be two very popular open source versions of PBXs, right? So how does a proxy differentiate? Well, a proxy doesn't initiate a call. It's not going to make a call. It's also not going to answer a call. It's going to help facilitate calls, connecting and disconnecting. So it's going to help set up and disconnect the calls. It's going to determine the logic of where calls might be able to go, but it's not actually going to answer the call, and it's not going to, initiate the call. Now, where it can help you on things like that is saying, okay, well, let me protect that PBX resource or that phone server resource by only giving it calls that it should answer. So I'm going to keep away all the calls that it shouldn't answer by just deflecting those away or ending them or doing whatever needs to happen there. It also does not do, Kamailio as a proxy, does not do audio or video processing. Now, we do integrate with RTP engine to help with proxying and bridging of video or audio, mostly audio. But Kamailio itself doesn't do anything with media, which is one of the things that keeps it so light and fluffy. But let's talk about using Kamailio as a WebRTC bridge. So the common way that I'm seeing WebRTC used with Kamailio would be as a bridge to a PBX or to PSTN. And so in our case, what would happen is a client would connect to Kamailio via WebRTC and using DTLS, SRTP type of audio. Kamailio would then take that WebSocket connection and then transfer it over to, let's say, UDP. Connecting that to the PBX for processing. If we're keeping it as just simple UDP on the PBX, we might then switch it from DTLS encryption type of RTP to just simple RTP so that the PBX can understand it. If it then the PBX wants to say, okay, yes, this is a valid call that should go out, let's say, to the public telephone network, Kamailio will then facilitate that and connect to a carrier via whatever method that carrier wants and send that call. The nice thing is there's so many PBXs that have been integrated into companies and systems out there that will not do anything with DTLS. Some of them won't even do SRTP, let alone DTLS SRTP, right? So having that ability to bridge it to just regular RTP, for example, just allows you to use a modern endpoint to communicate to a legacy system pretty easily. And then to further on top of this example, some of the bridging that we can do would be, on the WebRTC side, let's say that's coming in IPv6, 99% of the time it's TLS, right? And now that's especially a requirement. We've been integrating with WebSockets a lot for a long time, so we still do support just non-TLS WebSocket. But so let's say we're using TLS to connect to Kamailio, so we'll come down. Let's say the client will come through the internet via IPv6. Kamailio could be listening there and take that TLS, but make the connection to a legacy PBX via UDP and just using an IPv4 address. So here we have IPv6 on one side, IPv4 on the other side, and that could be LAN. On this scenario, the PBX isn't is local to the Kamailio, so it could be on a LAN. Of course, we could do private connections, whichever way you want. It doesn't have to be public internet. And then, for example, on the carrier base, maybe we're taking that one TCP. We still might be using IPv4, and we still might be doing regular RTP, or maybe, just SRTP. That's not DTLS style, but we could bridge all that together as well, and then go out. So we can maintain different RTP paths as well as different protocol connections. I know it sounds boring, but having something in there that handles that and proxies that information and bridging it really becomes helpful in keeping your application simple, right? So your application can just do TLS, keep it as it is, and then we can implement that bridge for you. And the beautiful aspect on that is just connecting to PBX. And we saw that a lot with COVID, right? So when you had companies that immediately went into lockdowns, they might have an old Avaya system, they might have some old Cisco systems or something like that. They cannot change, right? They cannot bring in something really easily, something easy for them to connect to. The thought of trying to deploy phones out to people's houses and try to control them is just ridiculous, right? So they brought in a lot of WebRTC people to make a client for their employees or whoever to use. They could connect from their home or from wherever they would, and Kamailio would then bridge that to their legacy PBX. As far as their PBX is concerned, this is just a simple endpoint. And then, life goes on. So it really assisted with work from home, facilitated that. I'm also seeing a lot of WebRTC for call centers. So, moving agents away from using physical phones to now using an application where, information can be provided, and doing amazing things that web developers can do for control panels and visuals and everything like that, and helping the agent handle a customer support call in theory effectively, so that we know that we're doing our best to make sure that people have a good experience. However, most of us still, when we need support, don't have that great experience, but it's not our fault. We're doing our best. So, and that's another aspect that we see it a lot is with call center approaches. It helps reduce costs and really makes it easy to deploy. On the Kamailio side, with that module-based system that we talked about, the main module that handles WebSocket is very creatively called WebSocket. The specific module link is listed right there. And then at the, don't worry about writing that down. I'll post the slides up in a PDF, and you could get all the links on there. I'll tweet it out or something. But it's a pure WebSocket server based off of RFC 6455. It handles your connection establishment, your connection management, so it's going to keep that alive. It also then takes the framing for that WebRTC to turn it into either SIP or MSRP relay for the sub protocols. Again, using using RFC based standards. We support WebSockets and secure WebSocket. There is 2 other modules that you do need, 2 or 3 depending on your module, your needs, and that's the XHTTP module, and that just basically allows Kamailio to listen for HTTP protocols, which makes sense with how WebSockets work, right? As well as a NAT helper, which is what Kamailio uses to help with NAT and outbound modules. And then the other main aspect that we use here is RTP Engine, and that is from a company named Sipwise. It's also open source, and that's a media proxy. It's under GPL3, and it's a great bridge for DTLS SRTP to regular SRTP or not traditional, but non-DTLS SRTP. It can handle RTCP MUX as well as DMUX if I want to, just have RTCP MUX on one side. And it can also transcode, which is great if you wanted to, let's say, use Opus for your endpoint, but then use regular ULAW for the PSTN, because most PSTN is either going to be ULAW if you're in US or Japan, and ALAW if you're pretty much anywhere else. The really great thing about RTP Engine is it handles a lot of calls because it can work in the kernel space. However, if you are doing transcoding, that happens outside of the kernel, so there is a little bit of a performance impact, and a little bit being significant. But that being said, it's phenomenal for doing this type of bridging, and it just makes connecting two very different protocols very seamless. And for more information on Kamailio, I would love to have you visit the Kamailio website, which is kamailio.org. We're on GitHub. Kamailio has a bunch of different repositories there. If you're into Matrix, which I am, there's the whole Kamailio space, and on our own Matrix node of matrix.kamailio.dev. So we have a room Kamailio, as well as a whole space of different rooms like jobs and things like that. We have a Kamailio World. This year it's going to be online. Hopefully next year it will be back in person in Berlin. And from the kamailio.org website, you can join our mailing lists, which are very friendly and helpful. We're also active on Twitter and other media. I think that there's a Slack space as well. And with that, I would love to entertain any questions that anybody has. And thank you very much for this time.
Thanks a lot, Fred. Appreciate it. We've got a question I want to get to quickly from Guillermo, who says, hello, Fred. Thanks for the presentation. Has Kamailio any specific module to bridge WebRTC with SIP? So is that and this question was before some of your later slides, but is that using like the WebSocket module you described?
Yeah, that WebSocket module is what will allow that framing from WebRTC to SIP itself, right? Because Kamailio out of the box is SIP. So it does SIP just in its core. And so that WebSocket module will now allow it to basically translate WebRTC and SIP together and have a great party.
And Guillermo followed up with another question here. Is this bridge only for legacy systems? What do we need Kamailio for between WebRTC and PBX if we can use a WebSocket module directly?
I love this question. As a side note, my wife, before the pandemic, we had a bakery, and so we had Kamailio cookies. And when there was a really good question, we would give you a cookie, and that is a cookie question. That's a fantastic question. So the bridge is not just for legacy systems. What I love about the bridge is it allows you to use Kamailio with these different protocols. So yes, you can connect WebRTC to Asterisk. And yes, you can absolutely connect WebRTC to FreeSwitch. They both have modules inside. But then when you do so, you're constrained to that specific Asterisk or that specific FreeSwitch, right? So when that FreeSwitch is down, you're going to need some other logic to go to a different one. Same with Asterisk, right? And there's limitations onto how much that system can do. Now, what we've seen with Kamailio and what I've seen with a lot of deployments is the more that Asterisk and FreeSwitch do, the less it does well. So, for example, if I could take all registrations off of Asterisk, I can get it to do a lot more calls because it's not doing all of this overhead and things like that. Same with FreeSwitch. FreeSwitch can do a decent amount of calls. It can do even more if I can take some of this overhead of just SIP registrations, SIP, keep alive, things like that away. If I'm doing TLS on my Asterisk or my FreeSwitch, I have the overhead of handshakes. I have the overhead of, just, that keeping that connection up and all of that kind of aspect, where if I can do that on Kamailio, which can do more of it because it's doing much less of the work when the call is answered, right? So save that CPU on Asterisk and FreeSwitch for when the call is actually answered and you need to do something with the media. You need to listen for, whatever. You need to split the call out and start making text to speech or speech to text, however you want to do it. If I can keep that UDP and RTP, for example, I can keep it very low. I can lower my CPU, I can lower my memory on FreeSwitch and then do more, keep it more reliant, things like that, as well as handle some failover instances. So if FreeSwitch, let's say, for example, does crash, I can pick up another FreeSwitch, which will technically keep the call open depending on how you have it deployed. Since my connection to Kamailio wasn't on that FreeSwitch, that call still remains up. So there's one benefit of, for example, keeping Kamailio in between for not just legacy systems. I'm increasing the performance of my system as well as using some of the features that Kamailio might have, such as load balancing and things like that, to connect to many clients. So, for example, FreeSwitch would like to say, all right, maybe I could keep 2,000 calls. Kamailio 2,000 calls is a very low day. So I could have 2,000 calls on this FreeSwitch, 2,000 calls on this FreeSwitch, 2,000 calls on this FreeSwitch. I can really keep everything going. On FreeSwitch, if I had a few thousand registered endpoints, I'm going to start seeing a slowdown. Where on Kamailio, having hundreds of thousands of endpoints isn't anything that's unheard of. And so
Excellent.
There's my answer to that awesome question.
Thank you, Guillermo. Sorry, we can't give you a cookie today, but I hope you have one for that excellent question.
Yeah, they were good.
I bet. All right, so we're going to take a short pause here, and we've got a little brief announcement here about a training program that we have at WebRTC Ventures. This is a great time for you to put in additional questions that you have into the streaming platform of your choice. We'll be right back after this with more questions for Fred. As a viewer of WebRTC Live, you already know how important WebRTC development is to the modern web. Now it's time for you to grow your career by learning to build live video applications and joining our team at WebRTC Ventures. Go to WebRTC.ventures and apply to join the next cohort of our WebRTC training program. You'll have free access to advanced courses, mentorship from our team, and those who are accepted into the second month will receive a paid development contract and join our team of WebRTC development experts. Go to WebRTC.ventures now and earn your place in our team of video development experts. All right. Fred, I have a couple of quick questions for you, and then we're going to get to additional viewer questions.
Sure.
So you mentioned that Kamailio does NAT really well, network traversal. So does it have like stun and turn built into it, or it just does its own form of NAT that eliminates that? How does that work?
So there is a NAT helper module that really helps with some aspects of this, but one of the ways that it can is to test what the connecting IP address is versus what IP address the endpoint thinks it is, and then just knowing that as a translation. So that's one of the easiest ways, is going, okay, well, the address that this client thinks they are is a NATed address. It's in a NAT space. It's not in the same NAT space that my NAT is in, because one of the other aspects of this handling NAT well is that, especially for deployments on, let's say, AWS or your own network, especially now with the scarcity of getting public IP addresses on IPv4 space, I most likely will be NATed as well. So Kamailio can help with publishing my public IP address by still using my NAT address for everyday life, and then identifying what IP address the customer is, or the endpoint is coming in from, and then updating their SDP and their SIP or WebRTC connection as appropriate. And then we use NAT helper for some of those modules in terms of doing aliases, so we can keep out of it, so that when the call leaves and comes back, we still know what they connected to us via and things like that. So we can still the NAT helper helps us maintain those connections, but just out of the box, we can determine the public IP address.
Okay, great. All right, we have another question from a viewer here. Omid says, thanks for the presentation. How do you implement high availability for WebRTC using?
All right. So how do we implement it? Very well. Thank you. No, just a joke. There's a bunch of different ways that you can do this, and it really depends on your deployment stack and where you're deploying, as well as how you're deploying it. So yes, you can use Keep Alive D. I like UCARP. So if you are in a data center or in a facility that allows you to have virtual IP addresses and things like that, we can then use some of Linux abilities to come up on an IP address, identify myself as that virtual IP, and go from there. On AWS, the way that we might do it is with some of the load balancers that would come in from AWS, some of their high availability load balancers, and then position that going forward, which is also how we tend to deal with things like Anycast and opportunities like that. So unfortunately, there's a short answer of there's many different ways of handling high availability, including Kamailio has its own built-in distributed messaging that we call, again, creatively DMQ. And that's built on SIP so that we can help keep state through however many Kamailios there are.
Excellent. Thank you, Fred. I know that the SIP protocol sometimes gets a bad rap in the WebRTC world. And a lot of WebRTC was designed with VoIP protocols in mind, which has led to, some would say, more complexity than say a pure JavaScript developer wants. Kind of what are your thoughts on how SIP has impacted WebRTC design and the pros and cons of that?
Yeah, so SIP is not everyone's cup of tea, right? And I love SIP. I absolutely love SIP now. And I spent many years not loving it. And so the more you deal with SIP, you run into situations where you realize how awesome SIP can be. And you're like, oh, all right, well, look, I have this crazy scenario that this is why that whole incredibly confusing section exists, because now I can make the call work. And so, yes, there's lots of talks about, upgrading SIP and changing SIP, but, it just works, and it works very well. The easiest way to compare it, of course, is with, there's a lot of similarity with HTTP. So, hey, I know what the 100s series are if I get a response, and the 200 and the 300 and the 400 and the 500, right? So at least we have some sort of commonness to start a discussion with. But yeah, it's a really an unforgiving language. And every time you think of, well, this is stupid, I wish it wasn't there, something else will happen, and you realize, wow, that's really awesome that something that was written 20 years ago can handle something of today's problems.
Yeah. All right.
But yeah, I had hair when I started with SIP, and under this path, there's none.
So your message is stick with it, kids.
Yeah, I mean, it's I will say that you will appreciate it more and more, but it's not a fun learning curve,
right?
And it's difficult, but there's some great tools out there that can really help you facilitate the ease. Like, I really wish, like, Homer is an amazing SIP capture tool. Kamailio integrates with that very well, and it will capture your WebRTC traffic as well. So, if that kind of tool existed, in the early 2000s, I would have been a very happy person. SNGrep is also a really great way of capturing some SIP traffic. And in Kamailio, we have a SIP dump module that will take even your WebRTC traffic and then dump it into a PCAP that's much easier for you to see. Oh, well, look, this endpoint is sending me. I had one the other day where it forgot to put a closed bracket, right? So it's whatever the protocol is, it's always the same problem of a typo.
Right, for sure. Yeah. So for any other resources that you would recommend for someone who does sort of come at this from a JavaScript, web development type of background, doesn't have the VoIP background you have, but is kind of crossing this bridge a little bit. What's the best way to learn?
Yeah, Dan Jenkins is a WebRTC person that
Nimble
he's
8.
also he's annoying in that he's a great friend. So I love Dan with all my heart. He gave a presentation years ago that's stuck with me. It lives rent free in my head, which is that your next phone developer is a web developer, right? And so on the telecom side, we're doing our best to make the tools that web developers would normally use readily available in our system. So on Kamailio, the way that was done, and Daniel, who's the largest contributor, really hard on Chemi, which allows you to write most of your Kamailio configuration and setup in popular web languages, Python, Lua, JavaScript, things like that. There's also other projects, Drachio and Jabbones out there that do node-based aspects of telephony as well. So that would help some of these aspects, so you don't at least have to learn a whole new syntax or a whole new language. And then the concepts are where if you try to boil it down to as simple as possible, when it comes down to it, you're trying to set up a call, and then you're trying to end a call. And then the little things in between is we're just trying to figure out who's calling and who should answer it. And if you try to keep it in those simple terms, it will work better. And that's where Homer as a project really helps you with identifying, well, what does this person sending, who do they think that they're going to? What does Kamailio see from that person? And does it, am I saying what I should be saying? Is it hearing what it should be seeing? Things like that. Those other projects as well. There's some presentations out there. So all the Kamailio World presentations live on YouTube. And there's some great ones. Dan Jenkins has several, and I know he's a good friend of the WebRTC World. And he has many about dealing with some of the telecom issues that he's run into as a web developer.
Nice. Yeah, I think Dan is now officially the most quoted person in WebRTC Live episodes. You're far from the first. So that's an indicator also to me. It's been a little while since Dan's been back on WebRTC Live. So Dan, if you're watching, call us.
Well, the stuff he's doing with Broadcaster looks really exciting.
Yeah, it is. It is really cool. I definitely have checked that out before. So so most of the use cases that we think about in SIP and Kamailio, I believe, and into the call center audio only. Can you talk a little bit about the role of video and when and how that's used, and is there anything different that Kamailio does in that scenario?
So Kamailio is agnostic towards any media, right? So it's not really touching the media. So as long as it has, as long as your PBX or that endpoint can handle the media, Kamailio doesn't care. Daniel had an amazing quote of Kamailio will work with all codecs and the ones that haven't even been created yet, right? Because we just simply don't touch a codec. So Kamailio is just going to help set up that call. So on the call setup aspect, that's where Kamailio comes in. Now, RTP Engine will proxy media. And so it should proxy the video fine in terms of that. Although I think when you're getting into video, I think the less that touches it is probably better. So at that point, you might want to have, depending on what you're doing for the video, whether it's like a conference or something like that, where you're using Janice and I love Janice. Lorenzo's a awesome person. When you're doing things like that, maybe just going directly to that. So that might be one where you're doing outside of Kamailio only. And I say that only because when we're dealing with a lot of the video apps, most of them are true web apps where it's web to web, and you might just be going directly to that application. You might not have a need specifically for Kamailio to help with that connection.
Yep, that makes sense. You talk a little bit just about like the click to call type of use case in contact centers, and for someone looking, maybe they're in a completely traditional, if that's the right term to use, contact center at this point, and they're looking to add in click to call for the first time. What are some of the gotchas that they should look out for?
Yeah, and this is where I really like Kamailio to helping connect, right? Because when it comes down to it, we're in a really weird timing where for a lot of support and everything like that, I might have an app on my phone, okay, where WebRTC might make really good sense to make that connection. But at the same point, the end person answering that call is not using an app. Most likely they're using, they're sitting in front of a desktop. They might have a phone in front of them. They're clearly bound by, script and things like that they're dealing with. And a lot of times where you see companies going is that they're not even employees, right? It's outsourced to a specific call center.
Right.
So they're not going to be just handling your calls. So I'm going to be handling a supermarket, and then I'm going to be handling a taxi, then I'm going to be handling something else as an agent. And so where Kamailio really helps with that is taking that application that you've made. Okay, so now here I'll go to Kamailio, and then let me go to this other call center that I have to. And I might have my number one call center, and it may be in this location. And then, okay, they didn't answer, or they are at capacity. So now I need to fail over to the next one without impacting my user experience. So they're just connecting to Kamailio. Kamailio is handling that logic of where's the best place to go, and things like that. One of the neat things with Kamailio is it can also do latency-based routing with dispatch nodes. So it could go, okay, you know what, right now, this is the best location because their latency is the lowest. So let me send them there. Next call might go somewhere else, depending on the latency of the system. So it can take those network connections into account.
Is that the least cost routing that you referenced earlier?
No, least cost routing is your traditional carrier base where, hey, I'm going to go out to PSTN. Let me send it the it could be least cost in, could be financial. So let me go with the one that's going to charge me the least, or it could be least cost being most preferred. So I most prefer this route because it's the best quality, right? Which ends up costing me lowest amount in terms of support later on.
Right.
Because everything has a cost, right?
Yeah, for sure. Including latency, for sure. Okay, excellent. Well, we're coming to the end of our time here, Fred, but really enjoyed having you. Would definitely like to have you back again some other time to talk more about these topics. Are there any other side projects or websites that you'd like to mention before we close today?
If you are getting into some SIP through LOD, we have API ban. So that's just apiban.org, which is a free service that we provide that is using honeypots to block well-known SIP attacks, because out there people are just doing SIP attacks left and right. So this will help block those from you. And it's a free service from apiban.org.
Excellent. All right. Thanks so much. And let's just remind our viewers how to get in touch with you. I think it's probably on this, little bit on this slide I'll bring back up.
Yep, qxork.com. Doesn't spell anything. It's letters that you don't have to pronounce. So qxork.com. And then on Twitter, I'm at Fred Posner.
All right. Awesome. Well, thanks again for joining us today, Fred. Really appreciate it.
It's a pleasure.
It's great to have you. And we'll definitely do it again. And for our viewers, thanks also to you for joining us. As always, this video will be available on the WebRTC Ventures YouTube channel and our blog at WebRTC.Ventures. To find out more about our upcoming episodes, follow us on Twitter at WebRTC.Ventures, on Twitch, LinkedIn, YouTube, and join our email list at WebRTC.Ventures. Thanks everyone for joining us today. Let's make it live.
Thanks for joining us for WebRTC Live. Visit our website at WebRTC.Ventures to learn more about our custom design and development services and to learn more about upcoming episodes of WebRTC Live.